December 12, 2017, and Detective Kevin Bohai is standing in the parking lot of a Fran's bakery outlet in Bellingham, Washington, and his hands are shaking as he holds a plastic cup and a Coca-Cola can sealed in evidence bags. And these ordinary objects that most people would have thrown away without a second thought are about to solve a murder that has haunted this community for 28 years. And inside the bakery, 50-year-old Timothy Bass is finishing his shift driving his delivery truck along the same routes he's driven for decades, serving the same small towns where everyone knows his name, where he's just the friendly bakery guy who brings fresh bread, and nobody suspects that this ordinary-looking man with his ordinary job has been carrying the darkest secret imaginable. And when Bohai walks into that bakery parking lot with a team of officers and tells Bass, "You're under arrest for the murder of Mandy Stavik," Bass's face goes completely blank, like he knew this day would eventually come. And if you think this is just another cold case story, then you need to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now, because what happened to 18-year-old Mandy Stavik and what it took to finally bring her killer to justice after 3 decades will keep you watching until the very last word, I promise you that. And the most chilling part, the woman who cracked this case wasn't a detective or a forensic scientist. She was Bass's co-worker who spent 3 months waiting for the perfect moment to grab his trash. Let's go back to November 24th, 1989, and I need you to understand what Acme, Washington was like, because the setting matters in this story. And Acme is a tiny unincorporated community in Whatcom County in the far northwestern corner of Washington state. And when I say tiny, I mean fewer than 250 people, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where kids can ride their bikes until dark, where people don't lock their doors, and where violent crime simply doesn't happen. And the community sits in a valley surrounded by the stunning North Cascade Mountains, and the Nooksack River winds through the landscape. And Highway 9 cuts through the middle, connecting Acme to slightly larger towns like Deming and Clipper. And this was a place where families came to escape the chaos of bigger cities, where they wanted their children to grow up safe and connected to nature. And on November 24th, 1989, which was the day after Thanksgiving, nobody in Acme had any idea that their sense of safety was about to be shattered forever. Amanda Teresa Stavik, who everyone called Mandy, was 18 years old, and she was home from college for Thanksgiving break. And Mandy had graduated from Mount Baker High School just months earlier, and she was in her first year at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, about 160 miles southeast of Acme. And she was bright and athletic and vivacious, and everyone who knew her used those exact words to describe her. And her mother, Mary Stavik, would later tell reporters, "I don't know that there are words to describe her because Mandy was everything, and Mandy played every sport you could imagine: basketball, track, softball, horseback riding, and her favorite activity was running, and she ran nearly every day. And her usual route took her from her family's home on Strand Road down to the Nooksack River and back, and it was about a 5-mile loop. And normally she ran with her mother, who would bike alongside her. But on this particular Friday afternoon, Mandy decided to go alone, and she took the family's German Shepherd, Kyra, with her for company. Mandy left the house around 3:30 in the afternoon, and she was wearing running clothes, and she clipped Kyra's leash and headed out the door. And several neighbors saw her during different parts of her run, and she waved and smiled like she always did. And she made it to the river and started back toward home. And witnesses would later tell police they saw Mandy jogging along Strand Road on her way back, and Kyra was trotting alongside her, and everything seemed completely normal. And Mandy should have been home within an hour, maybe 90 minutes at most. But when 2 hours passed and she still hadn't returned, Mary Stavik began to worry. And then Kyra showed up at the house alone, and the dog was agitated, cowering with her tail tucked between her legs, and there was silt from the river on her hindquarters, and Mandy knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Mary called Mandy's brother Lee, who lived nearby, and they began searching the route looking for any sign of Mandy, calling her name, checking the ditches, checking the riverbank, and when they couldn't find her, they called the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. And within hours, the entire community of Acme was searching for Mandy, and volunteers spread out across the valley, and they searched through the night with flashlights, and they checked every possible place an injured jogger might have ended up. And everyone was praying they would find her alive. Maybe she had fallen and hit her head. Maybe she had twisted an ankle and couldn't walk. Maybe Kyra had run off after something and Mandy had chased after her and gotten lost. And any explanation seemed possible as long as Mandy was alive. And if you're already hooked by this mystery, then do me a favor right now, pause for 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because this case is about to take you on a journey through 3 decades of investigation, heartbreak, and an ending that nobody saw coming. The search continued through November 25 and 26, and the story was all over the news in Washington state. And every television station and newspaper covered Mandy's disappearance, and the Stavik family was thrust into a nightmare. And what made it even worse was that this wasn't the first time the family had lost someone to violence, because Mandy's older brother Brent had been shot and killed while hunting in Alaska in 1975, when Mandy was just a child. And 17 bullets had been found in his back, and his murder had never been solved. And now the Stavik family was facing another unbearable tragedy. And on November 27, 1989, 3 days after Mandy disappeared, a search and rescue volunteer named Alan Pratt was searching along the South Fork of the Nooksack River, and he found Mandy's body floating in knee-deep water about 3 miles from her home. Mandy was naked, and she had been sexually assaulted, and she had drowned. And there was evidence she had been hit in the head. And the medical examiner determined that she had been alive when she went into the water. And the image of what Mandy must have experienced in her final moments was almost too much for anyone to bear. And investigators from the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office immediately began processing the scene. And even though DNA technology in 1989 was still in its infancy, they managed to collect DNA evidence from inside Mandy's body. And they photographed everything, and they searched for any other physical evidence. And they began the massive task of interviewing everyone who lived in the area, and everyone who had seen Mandy that day, and everyone who might have any information about what happened. Detectives interviewed Mandy's boyfriend, Rick Zender, and he cooperated fully and provided an alibi and was quickly ruled out as a suspect. And they collected DNA samples from approximately 30 men in the community, and none of them matched the DNA from the crime scene. And they interviewed a man named David Cracker, who told them that when he saw Mandy run past his location, he noticed a truck with a lighter on top following close behind her. And the truck had 2 people inside who appeared to be in their 30s. And police tried to track down that truck but were never able to identify it. And another man was seen near where Mandy disappeared, and a sketch was drawn, but that lead also went nowhere. And as weeks turned into months, the case began to go cold, and investigators were running out of leads, and the Stavik family was left with questions that nobody could answer. But here's what you need to understand about this community and about this case. And the murder of Mandy Stavik changed everything in Acme. And suddenly, parents didn't let their children walk alone anymore. And doors that had never been locked were bolted shut. And people started looking at their neighbors differently, wondering if the killer was someone they knew, someone they saw at the grocery store or at church or driving past their house. And the fear was palpable, and it lasted for years. And Kim Wagner, who would eventually play a crucial role in solving this case, later said that in 1989, she was 19 years old and delivering sandwiches to the Acme area for her family's wholesale business. And she remembered the South Fork Valley as a peaceful, serene little slice of heaven, and she had wanted to live there someday. But Mandy's death rocked the whole county, and that sense of safety was gone. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand who Timothy Bass was in 1989, because this is where the story gets really disturbing. And Timothy Forrest Bass was 22 years old in November of 1989, and he lived on Strand Road, the exact same street where the Stavik family lived, and there were only a few houses between them. And that means Mandy jogged past his house nearly every single day. And Bass knew her, and his younger brother Tom was friends with Mandy, and they had all attended Mount Baker High School together, although Bass was a few years older. And by all accounts, Bass was quiet and socially awkward and kind of a loner. And one of Mandy's friends, Annie Sergei, would later describe him as just a little bit of an oddball, but nobody suspected him of anything sinister. And he was just Tim Bass, the guy who lived down the road. But what people didn't know was that Bass had a dark side that he kept carefully hidden. And just 6 weeks after Mandy's murder, in January of 1990, Bass suddenly asked his girlfriend, Gina Malone, to marry him. And Gina was still a high school senior, and the speed of the proposal was unusual. But Gina said yes, and they got married. And Bass moved out of Acme to Everson, which was about 19 miles north. And it was like he wanted to distance himself from the crime scene. And Bass and Gina had 3 children together, and Bass got a job as a delivery driver for Fran's Bakery. And for the next 25 years, he lived what appeared to be a quiet, normal life, driving his routes, delivering bread and pastries to stores throughout Whatcom County. And nobody suspected that this mild-mannered bakery driver was a killer. But Gina would later tell investigators that her marriage to Bass was not what it appeared from the outside. And she said he was very controlling, that he would tell her what to do, what to wear, and whom to talk to. And she said that when he'd watch crime shows and movies about murder, he would always say the murderer was stupid and didn't cover his tracks very well, and that he wouldn't be stupid enough to get caught. And those comments take on a chilling significance when you understand what Bass had done. And in August of 2010, Gina filed a domestic violence protection order against Bass, alleging that he was both physically and verbally abusive to her and their 3 children. And the marriage eventually ended, but Bass continued working at Fran's Bakery and continued living in the area, and continued to hide in plain sight. Meanwhile, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office never forgot about Mandy, and Sheriff Bill Elfo, who took office in 2003, made it a priority to keep Mandy's case active. And he met regularly with Mandy Stavik to let her know that her daughter had not been forgotten. And he told her, "We're going to do everything we can to bring justice to Mandy and catch who was responsible." And in 2009, Elfo came up with a new strategy. And he had read a true crime book called The Blooding, which detailed a case in England where investigators had done a mass DNA sweep to catch a killer. And Elfo decided to try the same approach in Acme. And the plan was to create a list of every male who had lived in the Acme area in 1989, and who would have been within a certain age range, and then go door to door asking each of them to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. Detective Kevin Bohe was assigned to lead this effort, and the process was painstaking and methodical, and they had to figure out who lived where back in 1989 and how old they were, and then track down those men who in many cases had moved away decades earlier. And Bohe would later say, "I thought it's just a matter of time. We're going to ask the right person, or we're going to get the right sample of DNA. We just got to keep plugging away." And this DNA sweep went on for years, and they collected samples from dozens of men. And each time they sent a sample to the lab, they hoped for a match, and each time the results came back negative, and it was frustrating and exhausting. But Bohe refused to give up, and he knew that somewhere out there was the man who had killed Mandy, and he was determined to find him. And you need to hear this next part very carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is how a conversation at a water park finally put investigators on the right track. In June of 2013, 2 women named Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson took their children to a local water park, and they were there with a group of other mothers. And they had both attended Mount Baker High School, the same school Mandy had gone to. And they started talking about various topics, and eventually the conversation turned to Mandy Stavik's unsolved murder. And Heather and Marilee barely knew each other. They weren't friends, but as they talked about the case, Marilee said something that made everyone stop. And she said, "I know who killed Mandy." And she said it was a man named Tim Bass. And Heather couldn't believe what she was hearing because she had been thinking the exact same thing. And she said, "I think it was Tim too." And suddenly, these two women who had been carrying around suspicions for decades were finally voicing them out loud. Both Heather and Marilee had had disturbing encounters with Timothy Bass around the time of Mandy's murder. And Heather told the group that when she was 15 years old and Bass was 22, she had been sitting in a friend's truck with several other people, and Bass had made unwanted sexual advances toward her, and it was aggressive and inappropriate, and it scared her. And Marilee had a similar story, and Bass was a friend of her husband's, and one night, a few years after Mandy's death, Bass came to their house and made sexual advances toward Marilee. And both women said Bass had always given them a creepy vibe, but they had never reported their suspicions because in a small town like Acme, accusing someone of murder when you're not sure is a scary thing. And Marilee would later tell reporters, to accuse someone of something that we don't know for sure is a little scary. But hearing each other's stories gave them courage, and Marilee contacted a fellow classmate who worked for the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office and told him about their suspicions. Detective Bohe immediately looked into Timothy Bass, and what he found was remarkable. And Bass lived on Strand Road in 1989, just a few houses down from Mandy, and she would have jogged past his house almost every day. And Bass knew Mandy through his younger brother, who was friends with her, and Bass had attended Mount Baker High School and had even gone to some of Mandy's basketball games. And Bass had never been interviewed by police back in 1989, and he had never been asked to provide a DNA sample, and somehow he had completely slipped through the cracks. And now, in 2013, he shot to the top of the suspect list, and Bohe and his team decided to approach Bass directly, and in the fall of 2013, they went to Bass's home in Everson to talk to him. The interview was deliberately non-threatening, and Bohe would later describe how they approached it, and they knocked on the door, and when Bass answered, they said they wanted to talk to him about an old case from 1989. And when they mentioned Mandy Stavik's name, Bass pretended he didn't know who they were talking about, and he looked up and said, Mandy, oh yeah, she was the girl that they found on the river." And Bohe immediately knew Bass was lying because everybody in that area knew who Mandy Stavik was, and her case had been the biggest news story for years. And there was no way Bass could have forgotten her name, especially since she had jogged past his house every day, and his brother had been friends with her. And Bohe would later say that was definitely a red flag for me, which indicated to me he was obviously lying. And then they asked Bass if he would provide a DNA sample, and Bass refused. And he said, "I don't want to give my DNA. I've watched those crime shows. I see how many people go to prison because they've given DNA." And that refusal was another huge red flag, and it essentially confirmed that Bass had something to hide. So investigators had to come up with a new plan, and they couldn't force Bass to give them his DNA without probable cause for a search warrant. And they didn't have enough evidence yet to get a warrant. So they decided to put Bass under surveillance, and they followed him on his bakery delivery routes, hoping he would discard something they could collect for DNA testing. And they followed him night after night, and Bass was careful, and he didn't leave anything behind. And Detective Bohe would later say, Tim basically took his trash home. He didn't leave any chance that somebody would find something. And the surveillance went on for weeks with no results, and the case seemed to be stalling again. And then in 2013, Bohe went to Bass's workplace at the Franz Bakery outlet, hoping to get access to his delivery truck to swab for DNA. And listen, if you've made it this far, then you know we're approaching the moment of truth. So do me one more favor, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next involves one of the bravest acts of civilian cooperation in cold case history. When Detective Bohe arrived at the Franz Bakery outlet in 2013, he spoke with the store manager, Kim Wagner, and he told her there was an employee under investigation and they wanted to get route information and maybe collect a cigarette butt from his truck. And Wagner's first reaction was to shut them down, and she later said, "They came in and said there's an employee here under investigation for a case and they would like to get route information and maybe collect a cigarette butt. And at that point, I just shut them down. I was like, yeah, no, this is way above my pay grade." And she directed Bohe to the company's human resources department. And the corporate office for Fran's Bakery told investigators they would need a subpoena or search warrant to access any employee information or property. And since investigators didn't have probable cause for a warrant, they were stuck. And Kim Wagner didn't know at that time what case the police were investigating, and they hadn't told her it was about Mandy Stavik, and so she put the whole thing out of her mind and went back to work. But then, several years later, in 2017, Wagner was sitting in a bar with her husband and some friends, and they were having one of those wide-ranging conversations that covers everything. And somehow they got on the topic of discussing coworkers, and someone brought up Timothy Bass's name and mentioned that he used to live on the same street as Mandy Stavik. And immediately, Wagner's mind flashed back to that day in 2013 when Detective Bohe had come to the bakery. And she thought, is that why the police were at my work? And a light bulb went off in her head, and she realized the police must have been investigating Tim Bass for Mandy Stavik's murder. And Wagner had lived in the area in 1989, and she remembered how Mandy's death had traumatized the entire community, and she had never forgotten about Mandy. The next time Detective Bohe came to the Fran's Bakery, which was in the spring of 2017, he was still trying to get information about Bass's delivery routes, and Wagner was ready for him, and she took him into her office and she asked him directly, "Are you investigating the Mandy Stavik case?" And Bohe's eyes went wide like a cartoon character, and Wagner said, and then I said, "Was it Tim Bass?" And Bohe couldn't believe what he was hearing. And Wagner gave him all the information she had about Bass's routes, and then she said something that would change everything. And she asked, "You guys want DNA, don't you?" And Bohe said, "Well, yes." And Wagner said, "I can get it for you." And at that moment, Wagner made a decision that would finally bring justice for Mandy Stavik after 28 years. Now, investigators couldn't officially ask a civilian to collect evidence for them, and that would be problematic legally, and they couldn't give Wagner instructions on how to do it, but they told her that if she happened to come across anything that Bass had discarded, they could accept it if she brought it to them. And so Wagner began watching Bass at work, and she later said, "At this point, I'm thinking I'm working with somebody that potentially did this to Mandy, and I gotta know." And Wagner knew that Bass was extremely careful about not leaving anything behind, and Bohe had told her that Bass took his trash home with him. And so Wagner had to wait for the right opportunity, and she watched and waited. And 3 months went by, and Wagner was starting to wonder if she would ever get the chance. And then on August 10th, 2017, Wagner saw Timothy Bass drink from a plastic cup at work and throw it away. And she also saw him discard a Coke can. Wagner's heart was pounding, and she later told reporters, "I looked in the garbage and my heart was beating out of my chest." And she grabbed the plastic cup and the Coke can, and she put them in a Fran's Bakery bag, and she immediately called Detective Bohe, and she said, "I have something for you." And when Bohe arrived at the bakery and Wagner handed him that bag, he knew this was the moment they had been waiting for. And the items were sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for DNA testing, and everyone held their breath waiting for the results. And when the results came back, they confirmed what investigators had suspected. And the DNA from the cup and the can was a perfect match to the DNA that had been collected from Mandy Stavik's body in 1989. And the statistical probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Timothy Bass was 1 in 11 quadrillion. And to put that in perspective, there are only about 7.5 billion people on the entire planet. On December 12, 2017, exactly 28 years and 18 days after Mandy Stavik disappeared, Detective Kevin Bohe and a team of officers went to the Fran's Bakery outlet and they arrested 50-year-old Timothy Bass in the parking lot. And as Bohe's partner was handcuffing him, Bohe said, "You're under arrest for the murder of Mandy Stavik." And Bass's face went blank and he didn't say anything. And they put him in the police car and took him to jail. And then Bohe drove to Mary Stavik's house, and it happened to be Mary's birthday. And when she opened the door, the sheriff was standing there, and he said, "We've got him." And Mary said, "Who?" And she started laughing because she couldn't believe it. And she later said, "I really never dreamed. I really never dreamed it." And Mandy's sister Molly Brighton was with their mother, and she said, "What a birthday present." The arrest of Timothy Bass made national news, and the case that had haunted Acme for nearly 3 decades was finally moving toward resolution. And Bass was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, first-degree rape, and attempted first-degree rape, and he was held without bail. And the community was in shock because Bass had been living among them all this time, driving his delivery truck, serving their stores, walking their streets, and nobody had known. And when Detective Bohe called Kim Wagner to tell her about the arrest, Wagner was overwhelmed, and she later said she felt like Mandy had guided this to get justice. And she said, "For me, the end goal was for that mom to finally know and for Mandy's soul to be finally free. And it was all worth it."
But Wagner also had concerns, and she worried about how people might react when they found out she had turned Bass in, and she didn't know if she would lose her job. And she took steps to protect herself. And Fran's Bakery actually had an armed guard at the store for about 3 weeks after Bass's arrest because nobody knew how Bass's family or supporters might react. And Wagner later said, "I'm proud of what I did, and I like to think that's just me. I like to do the right thing. But it wasn't easy." And the fact that an ordinary bakery manager had shown such courage and dedication to getting justice for Mandy was remarkable, and without Kim Wagner's actions, Timothy Bass might still be free today. Bass's trial began in May of 2019, and it was held in Whatcom County Superior Court, and longtime prosecutor Dave McEachron came out of retirement to try the case for free because he had been so moved by the story. And the prosecution's case was built primarily on the DNA evidence, which was essentially irrefutable. And they also presented testimony from Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson about their encounters with Bass. And they showed that Bass had lived on the same street as Mandy, and that he knew her, and that his behavior after being questioned by police had been suspicious. And they highlighted the fact that Bass had pretended not to remember Mandy's name and had refused to give a DNA sample. The defense team, led by attorney Stephen Jackson, argued that the DNA evidence only proved Bass had sexual contact with Mandy, not that he killed her. And Bass claimed for the first time that he and Mandy had been involved in a secret romantic relationship, and that they had consensual sex some time before she was murdered. And he claimed he had been mountain biking with his father when they ran into Mandy, and his father, who he described as having a way with people, had talked to her, and then Bass and Mandy started a relationship. And he said they would meet up when she was jogging and they'd talk and eventually had sex. But there was absolutely no evidence to support this claim. And Mandy had a boyfriend, Rick Zender, and nobody who knew Mandy had ever seen her with Bass or heard her mention him. And the prosecution pointed out that if Bass and Mandy had really been in a relationship, why had Bass never mentioned it in the nearly 30 years since her death? And why had he told police he didn't remember who she was? The defense also argued that there was no physical evidence putting Bass at the murder scene. And they pointed out that there was no DNA from Bass under Mandy's fingernails, and there was no evidence that he had been near the river. And they suggested that Bass had consensual sex with Mandy up to 12 hours before her death, and that someone else had killed her. But the prosecution demolished this argument by pointing out that Bass had cussed his mother to help construct a fake alibi, and he had asked his brother to make up a story about having sex with Mandy, and he had even suggested they blame it on his deceased father. And prosecutor Dave McEachron asked the jury why would he do this, and he said, "I ask you to use your common sense." And the answer was obvious. Bass knew he was guilty, and he was desperately trying to create reasonable doubt. On May 24, 2019, after 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just over 1 day, and they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. And Timothy Bass was convicted of first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, first-degree rape, and attempted first-degree rape. And when the verdict was read, there were tears in the courtroom, and Mandy Stavik and Molly Brighton embraced. And Kim Wagner, who had been excluded from the courtroom until after she testified, finally learned how pivotal her role had been in securing the conviction. And she later said she didn't know until after Bass was found guilty just how important those items she had grabbed from the trash had been. Bass's sentencing hearing was held on July 2nd, 2019, and the courtroom was packed with Mandy's family and friends and members of the community who had waited 3 decades for this moment. And victim impact statements were powerful and emotional. And Mandy's brother Mike Brighton told the court, "My family will never be healed, never be normal." And he said Timothy Forrest Bass must never be allowed to walk the earth as a free person, never, ever. And then Bass's mother, Sandra Bass, spoke in her son's defense, and she said that Tim had never tried to blame his father for Mandy's death and that he was innocent. And she said, "I do know my son is not guilty of this crime." And her faith in her son, despite all the evidence, was heartbreaking in its own way. Then Timothy Bass spoke in court for the first time, and his voice was flat and emotionless. And he said, "I would first like to say that I'm 100% innocent of this crime." And he said, "Furthermore, I don't believe I received a fair trial." And then, in what seemed like a calculated move to appear sympathetic, he said, "But the better man in me says I should say very little today and give this day to the Stavik family." And it was clear that Bass had not accepted responsibility and had no remorse. And the judge sentenced him to the maximum term allowed, which was 320 months or 26.6 years in prison. And prosecutors had wanted to seek a life sentence, but because Bass had not been charged with premeditated murder, the maximum sentence was limited. And Bass is currently serving his sentence at the Washington Correction Center, and he is not scheduled for release until January 24, 2036, when he will be 68 years old. The resolution of Mandy Stavik's case sent shockwaves through the true crime community, and it was held up as an example of how cold cases can be solved through a combination of persistent investigation, DNA technology, and civilian cooperation. And Sheriff Bill Elfo told reporters, "I've never seen a case that had an impact like this one did." And he said people felt that they didn't have a sense of safety, and it was the realization that we're not all that safe, and that there was a monster who was really living among us. And that sentiment captured what made this case so disturbing. And Timothy Bass wasn't some stranger who came through town and committed a random act of violence. And he was a neighbor. He was someone they saw regularly. He delivered their bread and lived his life right out in the open. And for 3 decades, he got away with it. Kim Wagner became a local hero, and her actions were praised by law enforcement and by Mandy's family. And Mary Stavik told reporters, "Kim is the one that made this possible. She made it possible to get justice." And Wagner remained humble about her role, and she said, "I just never forgot about Mandy, and that's why I did it." And she said she felt a basic human moral obligation to help, and her courage in the face of potential danger to herself was extraordinary. And Wagner later said, after Bass's arrest, she worried about backlash, and she didn't know if people would think she was a snitch or if she would lose her job. But she said it was worth it to give Mary Stavik closure and to honor Mandy's memory. And Wagner represents the best of what ordinary people can do when they see injustice and refuse to look away. The case also highlighted important questions about the initial investigation and why Timothy Bass was never interviewed in 1989, despite living on the same street as Mandy, and despite being someone who would have seen her jogging past his house regularly. And it's impossible to know whether Bass could have been caught sooner if investigators had been more thorough in identifying and interviewing everyone in the immediate area. But what's clear is that he slipped through the cracks and was able to live as a free man for 28 years after killing Mandy. And that's 28 years of freedom he didn't deserve, and 28 years that Mandy's family spent not knowing who killed their daughter and sister. The role of DNA evidence in solving this case cannot be overstated. And in 1989, DNA technology was relatively new. And the fact that investigators had the foresight to collect and preserve DNA from the crime scene meant that when technology advanced and when they finally got a sample from Bass decades later, they were able to make a definitive match. And this case should serve as a lesson to every law enforcement agency that evidence preservation is absolutely critical, and you never know when that evidence might be the key to solving a case. And cold cases should never be discarded or destroyed because advances in technology can reach back through decades to deliver justice.
There's also something profoundly moving about the persistence of Detective Kevin Bohai and Sheriff Bill Elfo and all the investigators who refused to give up on Mandy's case. And Bohai spent years doing that DNA sweep, going door to door asking men to voluntarily provide samples, and following up on every lead no matter how small. And Elfo made regular visits to Mandy Stavik to assure her that her daughter had not been forgotten, and that kind of dedication to a victim and to a family is what good police work looks like. And when Bohai finally arrested Bass in that bakery parking lot, it was the culmination of decades of work by multiple investigators. And the emotion in his voice when he later talked about the case showed how deeply these investigators care about the victims they serve. For the community of Acme, the resolution of Mandy's case brought a complex mix of emotions. And there was relief that the killer had finally been identified, and there was vindication that justice had been served, but there was also anger that Bass had been living among them all this time. And there was sorrow that Mandy's life had been cut so short. And Kim Wagner later said, "The South Fork Valley had been a little slice of heaven before Mandy's murder, and that sense of innocence had been destroyed. And even with Bass in prison, that innocence can never be fully restored." And the case changed how people in small communities think about safety. And it's a reminder that evil can exist anywhere, even in places that seem peaceful and idyllic. Mandy Stavik told reporters after the conviction that the only real closure would be to bring her daughter back. And that's the heartbreaking truth about cases like this. And no amount of justice can undo what was done. And Mandy is still gone. And she never got to finish college, never got to pursue her dreams, never got to have a career or get married or have children. And her family has lived with that loss every single day for over 3 decades. The empty chair at the table, the milestones that Mandy missed, the grandchildren Mary will never have, all of that is a permanent wound that will never fully heal. But at least now they have answers. And at least they know that Bass is in prison and that Mandy's case has been resolved. The case of Mandy Stavik and Timothy Bass teaches us several important lessons. And first, it shows that cold cases should never be given up on. And Detective Bohai's persistence and his willingness to spend years doing a DNA sweep demonstrates that sometimes solving a case requires methodical, patient work. And second, it shows the critical importance of DNA evidence. And the fact that DNA collected in 1989 could be used nearly 30 years later to secure a conviction is remarkable. And third, it shows that ordinary citizens can play a vital role in solving crimes. And Kim Wagner wasn't a cop or a forensic scientist, but her courage and her willingness to grab that cup from the trash made all the difference. And fourth, it reminds us that killers often hide in plain sight. And Timothy Bass wasn't some shadowy figure. He was a delivery driver who interacted with people every day, and nobody suspected him. And fifth, and perhaps most importantly, this case reminds us that victims matter. And Mandy Stavik was a bright, talented young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and she deserved better than what happened to her. And the fact that investigators never gave up on her case and that Kim Wagner risked her own safety to help solve it shows that Mandy's life had value and that justice is worth fighting for no matter how much time has passed. And Mandy's story will be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as an example of how persistence, courage, and technology can deliver justice even after decades. If you've made it this far through this story, then I want you to do something for me right now. And I want you to hit that like button if you haven't already. And I want you to subscribe to this channel because these stories matter and these victims deserve to be remembered. And I want you to leave a comment and tell me what you thought about this case, and tell me whether you think Kim Wagner is a hero and whether you would have had the courage to do what she did. And I want to hear from you because conversations about justice and about how we solve these terrible crimes are important and they matter. And as we close out this story, I want you to remember Mandy Stavik, not as a crime scene photograph or a cold case file number, but as an 18-year-old girl who loved to run and who was home from college for Thanksgiving and who had dreams of finishing her education and building a life.
And I want you to remember her mother, Mary, who waited 28 years for answers and who never gave up hope that someday she would know who killed her daughter. And I want you to remember Detective Kevin Bohe, who spent years knocking on doors and collecting DNA samples and who refused to let Mandy's case go cold. And I want you to remember Kim Wagner, an ordinary bakery manager who saw an opportunity to help and who had the courage to grab a cup from the trash and change everything. The evil that Timothy Bass committed on November 24, 1989 cannot be undone. And Mandy is gone, and her family has lived with that loss for over 3 decades. And no prison sentence can bring her back, and no amount of justice can erase the pain that the Stavik family has endured. But at least now they have answers, and at least they know that Bass will spend the rest of his productive years behind bars. And at least they know that Mandy's case touched people like Kim Wagner, who cared enough to take action, and that law enforcement never forgot about their daughter. And that's something. And in a world where so many cases go unsolved, where so many families never get answers, where so many killers walk free, that's actually a lot. And there's something poetic about the fact that it was Bass's own carelessness that finally brought him down. And for 28 years, he had been so careful, and he took his trash home, and he never left anything behind. And he thought he had gotten away with murder, and he probably believed he was smarter than the police and that he would never be caught. But on August 10, 2017, he let his guard down for just a moment, and he threw away a cup and a Coke can. And that moment of carelessness, combined with Kim Wagner's courage, was his undoing. And it's a reminder that criminals can run, but they can't run forever, and that eventually their luck runs out, and that justice has a long memory. The image of Timothy Bass being led away in handcuffs from that Fran's Bakery parking lot, the same place where he had worked for decades, the same routes he had driven, the same stores he had served, is powerful. And his coworkers had no idea they were working alongside a killer, and his customers had no idea that the friendly bakery driver who brought their bread and made small talk had raped and murdered an 18-year-old girl. And Bass had hidden in plain sight for so long that he probably thought he was untouchable. But DNA doesn't lie, and Kim Wagner's courage exposed him, and Detective Bohe's persistence caught him. And now he's spending what should be the best years of his retirement behind bars, and that's exactly where he belongs.
One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is Bass's complete lack of remorse. And at his sentencing hearing, he stood in front of Mandy's family and said, "I'm 100% innocent." And he showed no empathy, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, no acceptance of responsibility. And this is typical of psychopaths who commit these kinds of crimes. And they believe they're smarter than everyone else, and they believe they can manipulate people. And they have no capacity for genuine remorse because they lack the ability to feel empathy for their victims. And Bass's mother's statement that she knew her son was innocent despite overwhelming DNA evidence shows how deeply denial can run in families, and how difficult it is for parents to accept that their child is capable of such evil. But the jury saw through Bass's lies, and they understood that his claim of a secret relationship with Mandy was a desperate last-minute fabrication designed to explain away the DNA evidence. And prosecutor Dave McEachran's question to the jury, why would Bass construct a fake alibi and try to get his brother to lie for him if he was innocent, was devastating. And the answer was obvious. And Bass knew he was guilty. And he had spent 28 years hoping this day would never come. And when it did, he still couldn't bring himself to tell the truth. And his insistence on maintaining his innocence even after conviction shows a level of narcissism and sociopathy that's truly chilling. The community response to Bass's conviction was overwhelmingly positive, and people who had lived in fear for decades finally felt like they could breathe. And the monster who had terrorized their community had been identified and imprisoned. But there were also people who knew Bass, who had worked with him, who had been served by him, who couldn't believe it. And cognitive dissonance is powerful, and it's hard to reconcile the image of a friendly bakery driver with the reality of a brutal killer. And some people wanted to believe Bass was innocent despite the evidence, and that's human nature. And we want to believe that we would recognize evil if we encountered it, and that monsters look like monsters.
But the truth is that predators often appear completely normal, and that's what makes them so dangerous. Kim Wagner's role in solving this case became the subject of significant media attention, and she was interviewed by major news outlets and true crime shows, and she appeared on CBS's 48 Hours, which did an extensive feature on Mandy's case. And Wagner remained humble throughout all the attention, and she consistently said she was just doing what anyone would do, and that she never forgot about Mandy, and that she felt a basic human obligation to help. And her modesty made her heroism even more impressive. And the fact that she waited 3 months watching for the right opportunity shows incredible patience and dedication. And the fact that she was willing to potentially put herself at risk by collecting evidence against a coworker shows real courage. Fran's Bakery supported Kim Wagner throughout the ordeal, and they never disciplined her for her actions, and they provided security when there were concerns about potential retaliation. The company recognized that Wagner had done the right thing, and they stood behind her. And this is how employers should respond when their employees step forward to help solve crimes. And Wagner's actions reflected well on the company and on the values of ordinary people who refuse to look away when they have information that could bring justice. And the partnership between Wagner and law enforcement shows what's possible when civilians and police work together toward a common goal. The technological aspect of this case is also worth examining because DNA technology in 1989 was vastly different from what exists today. And the fact that investigators were able to preserve evidence in a way that allowed it to be tested decades later using technology that didn't exist when the crime was committed is remarkable. And this case should be studied by every cold case unit in the country as an example of why evidence preservation is so critical. And you simply cannot know what technological advances might come in the future and what evidence might become useful years or decades down the line. And destroying evidence because a case has gone cold is short-sighted, and it robs families of potential justice.
The case also highlights the importance of community tips and civilian cooperation, and it was Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson's conversation at that water park in 2013 that put investigators onto Timothy Bass. And if those two women hadn't finally voiced their suspicions to each other and then reported them to police, Bass might never have been identified as a suspect. And this shows that sometimes the information needed to solve a case is out there in the community, but people are afraid to come forward, or they don't think their information is important, or they don't want to get involved. And law enforcement agencies need to create environments where people feel safe reporting tips, and where they understand that even small pieces of information can be crucial. The fact that both Heather and Marilee had uncomfortable encounters with Bass around the time of Mandy's murder, and both had independently suspected him but never reported it until that conversation, shows how predators benefit from people's reluctance to speak up. And Bass's behavior toward both women was aggressive and inappropriate, and it should have raised red flags. But in 1989 and the early 1990s, women's reports of sexual harassment and assault were often dismissed or minimized. And there was tremendous social pressure not to make waves, not to accuse someone without proof. And that culture of silence allowed Bass to continue living freely for decades. And this is why movements like Me Too are so important, because they encourage people to speak up, and they create space for victims and witnesses to come forward without fear of being dismissed or blamed. Looking back at this case, there are several what-ifs that haunt the story. What if Bass had been interviewed in 1989 when investigators were canvassing the neighborhood? And what if he had been asked to provide a DNA sample during that initial investigation? And what if Heather and Marilee had reported their suspicions earlier? And what if Kim Wagner hadn't been working at Fran's Bakery in 2017 or hadn't made the connection between the police visit and Mandy's case? And what if Bass had never thrown away that cup and Coke can? And any one of those what-ifs could have changed the outcome, and Bass might still be free or the case might still be unsolved. But instead, all the pieces came together at exactly the right time, and justice was finally served. The impact of Mandy's murder on her family cannot be overstated, and Mandy Stavik spent 28 years not knowing who killed her daughter, and that kind of uncertainty creates a unique form of torture. And you can't fully grieve because there are always questions, and you can't move forward because the case is still open, and you're always wondering if today will be the day you get answers.
And Mary attended vigils and memorials, and she kept Mandy's room exactly as it was, and she met regularly with investigators hoping for a breakthrough, and she never gave up. And that kind of maternal love and dedication is powerful. And when Detective Bohe finally told her they had arrested Bass on her birthday, it was like a lifetime of waiting had finally ended. Mandy's siblings also carried the weight of her unsolved murder for decades, and her brother Mike Brighton's statement at Bass's sentencing that "my family will never be healed, never be normal," captured the permanent damage that violent crime inflicts on families. And Mandy's sister Molly Brighton, who was with their mother when they learned of Bass's arrest, said the news was the best birthday present their mother could have received. And the relief and gratitude in their voices during media interviews after the conviction showed how much this resolution meant to them. And while nothing can bring Mandy back, at least they finally had answers, and at least they knew Bass was in prison, and at least they could honor Mandy's memory with the knowledge that her killer had been caught. The impact of Mandy's murder on her family cannot be overstated, and Mandy Stavik spent 28 years not knowing who killed her daughter. And that kind of uncertainty creates a unique form of torture. And you can't fully grieve because there are always questions, and you can't move forward because the case is still open, and you're always wondering if today will be the day you get answers. And Mary attended vigils and memorials, and she kept Mandy's room exactly as it was, and she met regularly with investigators hoping for a breakthrough, and she never gave up. And that kind of maternal love and dedication is powerful. And when Detective Bohe finally told her they had arrested Bass on her birthday, it was like a lifetime of waiting had finally ended. Mandy's siblings also carried the weight of her unsolved murder for decades, and her brother Mike Brighton's statement at Bass's sentencing that "my family will never be healed, never be normal," captured the permanent damage that violent crime inflicts on families. And Mandy's sister Molly Brighton, who was with their mother when they learned of Bass's arrest, said the news was the best birthday present their mother could have received. And the relief and gratitude in their voices during media interviews after the conviction showed how much this resolution meant to them. And while nothing can bring Mandy back, at least they finally had answers, and at least they knew Bass was in prison, and at least they could honor Mandy's memory with the knowledge that her killer had been caught. The location where Mandy's body was found in the Nooksack River, 3 miles from her home, is a place that will forever be associated with tragedy. And the river that had been part of her running route, the place where she went to exercise and enjoy nature, became the place where her life ended. And there's something particularly cruel about that. And the fact that she was found floating in shallow water, that she had drowned and been sexually assaulted, makes the crime even more horrific. And the image of what Mandy went through in her final moments is almost too much to bear. And this is why cases like this matter, and this is why we tell these stories. Because Mandy deserves to be remembered, and her suffering demands that we not look away. Today, Acme, Washington is still a small, tight-knit community, and the population is still under 300 people. And life goes on as it does everywhere. But the people who lived through Mandy's murder and the decades of not knowing who killed her will never forget. And that case changed the community in fundamental ways. And it robbed them of their sense of safety, and it made them look at their neighbors differently. And even with Bass in prison, that innocence can never be fully restored. And Mandy's case is part of Acme's history now. And it's a reminder that terrible things can happen anywhere, and that evil doesn't discriminate based on geography or population size. The fact that Timothy Bass will be 68 years old when he's released from prison in 2036 is cold comfort to Mandy's family. And by then, Mandy Stavik will be in her 90s if she's still alive. And Mandy will have been gone for 47 years. And Bass will have spent less than 2 decades in prison for stealing an entire lifetime from an 18-year-old girl. And this is one of the frustrations of the criminal justice system, and sentences often seem inadequate compared to the magnitude of the crime. And prosecutors wanted to seek a life sentence for Bass, but because he wasn't charged with premeditated murder, they were limited in what they could request. And this highlights the importance of how crimes are charged and how plea deals and sentencing guidelines can sometimes result in outcomes that feel unjust. But despite the limitations of the sentence, Bass's conviction represents a victory for justice, and it shows that cold cases can be solved, that persistent investigation, combined with DNA technology and civilian cooperation, can bring even the most careful killers to justice. And it gives hope to other families who are still waiting for answers. And it sends a message to criminals who think they've gotten away with their crimes that the clock is still ticking, and that advances in technology and dedicated investigators might still catch up with them years or decades later. And that's an important message because it might deter some people from committing crimes in the first place, and it might encourage some guilty people to confess before technology catches up with them. The media coverage of Mandy's case brought national attention to the power of genetic genealogy and DNA databases in solving cold cases. And this case, along with others like the Golden State Killer, showed the public how these tools work and why they're so effective. And it also sparked important conversations about privacy and about the ethics of using consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. And these are complex issues without easy answers. And there are legitimate concerns about privacy and about the potential for abuse. But there's also the undeniable fact that these tools are solving cases that would otherwise remain unsolved, and giving families the answers they deserve. And finding a balance between privacy rights and public safety is one of the great challenges of our time. Kim Wagner's statement that she felt like Mandy had guided this to get justice resonates with many people who work on cold cases, and there's often a sense that the victims are somehow present during the investigation and that they're guiding people toward the truth. And whether you believe in that literally or see it as a metaphor for the enduring impact of the victim's story, it's a powerful idea. And Mandy's case certainly had moments that felt fateful. And the conversation at the water park, the fact that Wagner happened to be working at Bass's employer, the fact that Bass threw away that cup on that particular day, all of it feels like it was meant to happen. And maybe that's just the human need to find meaning in tragedy, or maybe there's something more to it. And either way, Mandy's memory was honored by the people who refused to give up on her case. The parallel between Bass's refusal to provide DNA in 2013 and his eventual capture through discarded trash in 2017 shows both his arrogance and his ultimate downfall. And Bass told police, "I don't want to give my DNA. I've watched those crime shows. I see how many people go to prison because they've given DNA." And that statement reveals that Bass knew DNA could connect him to Mandy's murder, and he thought he was smart enough to avoid leaving any samples behind. And he took his trash home, and he was careful not to discard anything at work. But eventually he got comfortable, and he let his guard down. And that's when Kim Wagner was watching, and that's when she grabbed that cup and that Coke can. And Bass's belief that he was smarter than the police was his undoing. This case also demonstrates the value of old-fashioned detective work combined with modern technology. And Detective Bohe spent years doing a DNA sweep, going door to door, talking to people, following up on tips, and he built relationships with the community, and he earned people's trust. When Heather and Marilee came forward with their suspicions, Bohe listened, and he followed up, and he put Bass on the suspect list. And then he used surveillance, and he worked with Kim Wagner, and he patiently waited for the right opportunity to get a DNA sample. And when it finally came, he was ready. And that combination of relationship building, patience, persistence, and willingness to use new technology is what good police work looks like, and it's a model for how cold cases should be investigated. The fact that Bass's ex-wife, Gina Malone, told investigators about his controlling behavior and his comments while watching crime shows about how he wouldn't be stupid enough to get caught shows that Bass had been thinking about his crime for decades, and he knew he had done something terrible, and he was constantly worried about being caught. And his marriage to Gina just 6 weeks after Mandy's murder looks like an attempt to establish normalcy and to distance himself from the crime. And his move from Acme to Everson further suggests he wanted to put physical distance between himself and the scene of his crime. And all of these behaviors are consistent with someone who knows they're guilty and is trying to avoid detection. The domestic violence protection order that Gina filed against Bass in 2010, alleging physical and verbal abuse toward her and their children, shows that Bass's violence wasn't limited to what he did to Mandy, and he was a danger to the people closest to him. And this raises the question of whether there were other victims, and whether Mandy was Bass's only victim, or whether he committed other crimes that were never reported or never solved. And investigators have said there's no evidence linking Bass to any other murders, but given his pattern of sexual aggression toward women, it seems unlikely that his attack on Mandy was an isolated incident. And there may be other women out there who had encounters with Bass who never reported them, or who were assaulted but didn't know who their attacker was.
As we think about the lessons from Mandy's case, we have to acknowledge the role of luck and timing in solving cold cases. And if Kim Wagner hadn't been at that bar discussing coworkers, she might never have made the connection between the police visit and Bass. And if she hadn't been watching when Bass threw away that cup, he might have continued taking his trash home. And if DNA technology hadn't advanced to the point where samples from 1989 could be tested decades later, the evidence might not have been usable. And any number of things could have gone differently, and Bass might still be free. And this is why cold case investigators often talk about cases being solved through a combination of hard work and luck. And sometimes you can do everything right and still not catch a break. And sometimes a random conversation or a moment of carelessness by the suspect is what finally cracks the case. The emotional impact of finally solving a case that's been cold for decades is profound for everyone involved. And for the investigators, there's a sense of vindication and relief and pride that they never gave up. And for the family, there's a complex mix of grief and closure and gratitude and anger. And for the community, there's a sense that a wrong has finally been righted and that justice has been served. And for the victim, there's the knowledge that they haven't been forgotten and that people cared enough to spend decades searching for the truth. And all of these emotions were on display at Bass's trial and sentencing, and the tears and the relief and the anger were all genuine and all deserved. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for taking the time to learn about Mandy Stavik's story. And thank you for honoring her memory by listening to what happened to her, and by understanding that she was more than just a victim. She was a real person with dreams and a future that was stolen from her. And I hope this story has shown you that justice is possible even after decades, and that ordinary people like Kim Wagner can make an extraordinary difference, and that cold cases should never be given up on because families deserve answers and victims deserve justice no matter how much time has passed. If you enjoyed this video, and if you think Mandy's story deserves to be shared, then please hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel, because we're going to keep telling these stories, and we're going to keep remembering these victims, and we're going to keep showing that justice is possible. And I want you to leave a comment and tell me what you think about this case, and tell me whether you think Kim Wagner is a hero, and whether you would have had the courage to do what she did. And tell me what you think about the use of DNA evidence in solving cold cases. And I want to hear your thoughts, because these conversations matter and your engagement helps us reach more people. And as we close out this story, I want you to remember that Mandy Stavik went for a run on a November afternoon in 1989, and she never came home. And her family spent 28 years not knowing who killed her and living with questions that nobody could answer. And I want you to remember Detective Kevin Bohe, who refused to give up and who spent years knocking on doors and collecting DNA samples. And I want you to remember Kim Wagner, who grabbed a cup from the trash and changed everything. And I want you to remember that Timothy Bass thought he had gotten away with murder, and he lived his life and went to work every day and delivered bread to the same community he had terrorized. And for 28 years, he was free. But justice has a long memory, and eventually his luck ran out. Mandy Ann Stavik, you are remembered, and your story has been told, and your killer is behind bars. And you can finally rest in peace knowing that the people who loved you never stopped fighting for you, and that strangers like Kim Wagner cared enough to take action, and that justice, however delayed, finally arrived. And until next time, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment, and keep these conversations going, because every victim deserves to have their story told, and every family deserves to get answers. And together, we can make sure that cold cases don't stay cold forever.